Alright, the equivalent of a soldering tutorial for soldering XT90s with a soldering iron, 60 watt soldering iron. Always got flux here. Always flux the heck out of your wires every way you possibly can. That's what helps make the solder bond better and flow better into the wire. And to any type of gold connection for that matter. So always make sure it's perfectly fine to use as much flux as possible. I'm using flux paste. Normally with something like this being 10 gauge wires, I would use something like a liquid paste, more liquid based like a rosin flux pen. But for this, paste is normally readily more available and more inexpensive than the pen. But always have your tip and a sponge or some type of wet damp rag available that you can sit there and have your tip tinned. My tip's almost always tinned. Always tin your wire. You'll kind of be able to tell that you're getting a good bond with the flux and the solder to the wire when you start getting a little bubbling by the casing of the wire. That's how you know it's flowing into the wire. You're getting a good bond with your solder. Always clean your tip as much as possible. Keep any type of contaminants, they'll give you a cold solder joint. Give you an idea. Zoom in here. Okay, that didn't help. Oh, it's shiny all the way around, everywhere on the wire. A good way to test to make sure you got a good bond with your solder through your wire and your wire is completely tinned properly. You should be able to take your iron to the top of it and be able to add solder to the top of the tip, and it should teardrop to the bottom of your wire like so. Too much solder can be an issue, but not always. It's better to have too much than not enough. You can always unsolder things. And these are 10 gauge wires. The XT90 itself has a negative side and a positive side. The positive side tends to be the flat side. Now I'm going to tin the XT90 plug. As usual, like I said before, always flux real good, or rosin, whatever you want to call it. It's actually rosin flux. But flux before you do anything. I got a contaminant. Now the other side, which I kind of did another day in a video in another group, but I'll make sure there's some fresh solder in there. It's already been fluxed. Then you take your wire that you've already pre-tinned. I highly recommend, even though I know the solder has been fluxed on both of them, always add a little bit more flux. Helps the flow better. This is the positive side. With XT90s, they're going to come with this little clip that you're going to want to put on over the wire, like so. Slide it back. Then as for the bond between, clean your tip again, bond between the two. Gold plating tends to take better to heat and react faster than wire, in my experience. So I tend to get the wire nice and flowing right before you make the merge over to your connector, like so. Kind of get in between the two. Heat them both up nice. And once you get the bond, give yourself a little bit of a wiggle to them. Hold it in place till it cools. Don't blow on it. Don't make it cool faster than it has to. You can end up with a cold solder joint that way as well. A little extra solder. Sometimes you can get lucky and actually pick it up with the iron. Not always. Best way to use is use a desoldering cable or an extra piece of copper or wire to get it to bond to pick it up. So I'm just using some scrap wire here. As you can see, it's rather well in there. Not always 100%. So how I know for sure, it's just for the heck of it. Like I said before, too much flux is almost no such thing. Add a little bit more flux. Possibly a little bit more solder. The solder will help your tip get hot in the surface you want it to. Now after waiting, I don't know, I want to say 5 to 10 minutes depending. If you notice, I got a little bit of a goober on the back side here of the connector, which would interfere with that sleeve that I mentioned earlier for the XT90. So I'll tend to solder and let it even itself out a little bit more. You don't want no little spurs or pointy parts. You might have to use wire cutters to make sure that isn't like that, because it could interfere with the clamp. Now I'm going to do the negative side. Just like as before, a little bit more flux on everything. Clean the tip again. all the imperfections off. Get the wire hot. Adding solder to the tip would help this process a little bit more along. Like I said earlier about extra solder on the tip would help it flow better on the surface you're trying to get contact with and flow. Slide it in place once both are liquefied. Dab it a little bit. Let sit. For it to cool down on its own. Don't blow on it. Otherwise it could cause a cold solder joint. Observe what you did. Obviously the second time around it worked out a lot better. I got a good even flow. I'm very happy with the connection look. And then at this point, like I said before about the little plastic piece, unfortunately I didn't slide it over the black, but these are just cables, or the negative. These are just long 3-foot or 1 meter cables. In this instance, you take that piece I mentioned before, wait for everything to cool down a little bit because otherwise you could end up with a tackiness. Then you would slide this up to it. And there you go, you got an XT90 done nice, right and proper.